Welcome to Unit 3, Section 1, Sectional Differences. We're talking about nationalism and immigration and the sectional differences that were in the country early on and how immigration affected these differences as well. We've already talked about nationalism and how nationalism is to have incredible pride in your own country, most of the time believing that your own country is superior over all other countries. Now we're going to be talking about how that idea has an impact on immigration overall as well, how that impacts immigrants from the past, how that impacts immigrants from today. So here we're going to be looking at the sectional differences. So here's our objectives for this unit and this section. Focus question doesn't change. How does nationalism influence migration and immigration? So we're still talking about that. Objective 1, what differences separated the North from the South? What are you talking about? We've already kind of looked at this a little bit in the Civil War, but we're going to look at a little more specifically at the differences between the North and South and how this played a role in leading up to the Civil War. In Objective 2, we're going to be looking at diversity, and this one's not going to be found, this objective is not going to be found necessarily an answer in your notes, but you're going to write an answer to it. The question is, shouldn't we celebrate diversity? Obviously, the answer seems like it's a yes, but the problem is diversity is really complex and a really hard thing to look at when we're talking about millions of people living together. So diversity is great as long as people aren't taking your resources or changing your country or your traditions. All of a sudden, when that happens, people get really upset. If we look at the new mass, group of Californians moving to Idaho, a lot of Idahoans are frustrated because they feel like things are changing. And so when we say, shouldn't we celebrate diversity, we really need to look at what diversity is and what the best route to diversity is to make sure everybody's happy. In Objective 3, is it possible, and if so, how do people live in diversity? So that's going to be another opinion. I want you guys to be looking at that. In Objective 4, what correlations do we see with sectional differences today? So 3 of these objectives are going to be things that you're going to answer on your own. Really, the big one is going to be Objective 1 from the notes here. Okay, so we may or may not do this activity in class, so that'll be if we do or don't. But let's talk a little bit about what causes people to sectionalize, to have differences. Right now, just for a second, come up with as many things as you possibly can to list things that sectionalize different parts of America, whether that be religion or it be language or culture or traditions. Try to be as specific as possible. What cultural things, what religious things separate people, and just make as big of a list as you can. So pause this for just a second and make a list of probably 5 to 6 things that can sectionalize people. So now that you have your list, hopefully you've got some different understandings of how immigration can really impact a country. If you think about it, like, people even in our school sectionalize differently based on language, race, ethnicity, culture, all of those different things. And so maybe your list can demonstrate a little bit about why people are sectionalizing themselves off in the United States. So first off, we need to talk about the North. Why is the North different from the South? Why do we even call part of the country the North and part of the country the South? Well, between the years 1850 and 1860, the U.S. is going to start to embrace industrialism. Industrialism is the idea of manufacturing through machines to produce goods. So now instead of people doing, the cobbler at his house making shoes, we have an actual factory who produces large volumes of shoes. This is great for the consumer because it makes things cheaper, but it also makes the work a lot less skill-based. And so as you're going to see this, the North is going to really embrace this. The South is not. Industrialism really started with England, and it really came from England over into the North. The North started to have a lot of infrastructure, started to really embrace that. Where the South, they continued to keep the same thing that they had had forever, which is agriculture or farming. The Democratic Republicans' policies contributed a huge group. Now, we call this the Democratic Republicans. This is a political party at this time period, okay? And this political party contributed greatly to this idea of nationalism and immigration. So let's talk a little bit about why for a second. First off, in 1807, there was an embargo. An embargo is where you don't trade with anybody to a certain group. So in this case, we cut off complete ties with England after the War of 1812. And because of that, we're no longer doing any business with them. Now, this is good if you're a business owner in America. This means that you have a lot of opportunities and people have to start buying from you instead of England. This is bad for consumers because it means that they're going to have one less company to choose from to choose which goods they want. Okay, so because of that, Basically, the United States, because they're not trading with England anymore, needs to make their own factories to produce their own goods. So they're going to do this, and it's going to be, again, primarily in the north that they're going to be replacing these British factories to make these British goods, okay? Now, after the War of 1812 and the embargo ends, there's going to be a couple years where we're trading, but this is bad, obviously, for American business owners because they're worried that they are not going to be able to sell the goods to consumers, that now they've got another competitor named England that they have to compete against. So in a way to try to offset that, in a way to what do you do if a country is maybe hurting business in your country, specifically a country that might be hurting your business when it comes to manufacturing goods? Well, let's look at today. What has Donald Trump asked the United States, or what did he do because China produces so many goods in the United States or for the United States? Well, he creates a tariff, right? A tariff is a tax on imported goods. So they tax China when the goods are sent here, so that way they can hurt the foreign business to help the American domestic business. So in 1816, they created a tariff, and it was called the Tariff of 1816, a really original name. And this tariff was meant to hurt businesses, especially England, so that way American business owners could produce and do well. Okay, so here we have a picture of a Lowell factory. This would have been very typical, having young girls and some older ladies working in the factory and trying to get different things done here. This looks like a clothing line, like trying to make fabric and stuff like that for clothing. And so this would have been a factory that we would have seen. So look at this political cartoon here for a second. This comes from a newspaper at the time period. And as you look at it, try to decide which side is north and which side is south, and how do you justify that position. So the political cartoon, is it from a northern perspective or a southern perspective? And which side are they trying to depict as the north, and which side are they depicting as the south? So go ahead and pause this for a second, and we'll discuss it in a second. So if you picked that the side on the right is the north and the side on the left is the south, you would be correct. Here we have a couple reasons why. One, look at the weather vane. See, the weather vane has north to this direction and south to this direction. That demonstrates that, one, this tells you one side's the north and one side's the south. What other things? Well, look at this building. This looks like a factory. It's like some goods that are being either taken out or taken in. This wouldn't have been around really in the south. This would have been only primarily in the north. Look at this guy here. He is large. He even, some people might say, is fat. He is content. He's not worried. He's not struggling. He's got plenty of things he needs. Now on the left side here, look at, we have this old building that's breaking out. The windows are breaking out here. It says toilet. This is kind of a crappy building. Here we have a ship. Looks like the ship is docked. It's not out at sea. It's not sailing trying to get goods from England. It's just stuck here. And here we have the man. Look at how skinny he is. Look at how badly he's doing. And if you can read up here at the top, you have things that say like tariff, taxes, right? These are things, the weight on the southern back that are hurting it. So who would have written this? Would it be a northern perspective or a southern perspective? Would have been a southern perspective, right? Because they're trying to make themselves look really sad and things are bad while they're trying to make the northerners look, rich and have plenty. So this is a southern perspective, and it's demonstrating that the South is suffering under the tariff of 1816 and all of the new industry that's going on in the north. Okay? Now, what can we prove to see that the South was not doing very well? Well, look at this average imported goods. They went up by 20 to 25%. This is going to help industry and not farmers, okay? Specifically because now the farmers are not going to have an ability to sell off their goods at different countries. They're going to have to keep selling things domestically. So this is going to cause a lot of anger and a lot of frustration. So why does the North, why are they the ones that get the factories? Why are they the ones that start to build and the South keeps going into agriculture? Well, a big part of that is just tradition, for sure. But part of that's also because the North has a lot of capital. Capital is money that's needed to be invested. So if I have a business and I say I'm seeking capital, it's money I'm looking for to invest for my business. And they had a lot more of it. And so they had a lot of ability to build buildings, to have factories, way more than the South did. The South had a lot of money, but only in the hands of very, very few people. Only a few people in the South actually had huge plantations. And I think the statistics are less than 10% of Southerners actually had slaves. And of those that had slaves, it was like even less than that, like like 5% had more than 10. So there's these large plantations that are owned by just a couple of people. They have all the money, and the South is really going to stick with agriculture. That's their tradition. Any capital that the South does have is completely invested into slavery. So they are going to, instead of building it into buildings or factories or manufacturing or anything like that, they're going to invest it into slavery, okay? These transportation routes in the North were more numerous for shipping goods. The North has canals. They have even the start of some roads. They're going to eventually get some railroads, and all of this is going to make shipping things much, much easier and much better. Remember, when we talked about in the Civil War, the North had all the manufacturing. They could build all the guns. The South is really reliant on the fact that the North is building all the actual military weapons. Not only that, but to get those goods or to get those weapons around, remember how easy it was for the North versus the South. They've got a very hard time moving things around because they don't have good transportation routes. So let's talk about the kind of work that was going on. So there was the specialized work that was going on, and this really is going to hurt artisans. Now, specialized labor is when somebody goes and learns something and is doing something that other people can't do. So specialized work could be like welding. Not just anybody can weld. Only people who are specialized in that skill can actually do it. This is going to hurt these artisans because while they are specialized, it's going to be really not, instead of them doing all of the new factories aren't doing, they're not having one person create everything. There's no more cobblers. Instead, what you have is one person who's doing a small job, another person who's doing a small job, and so on and so on. This is going to create very cheap labor, and it's going to create unskilled labor, and it's going to hurt these artisans. So think about it. A guy who builds shoes at his house, he, from the very first step to the very last step, builds this great custom shoe. Usually that means it's going to be very high quality. It's going to have a lot of time and energy and resources in it. But because of all that, it's going to be more expensive. It took time. It took materials. It took a lot of energy and skill to be able to do that. However, if a factory is building a shoe, they now have ample amounts of time because they have lots of little people doing little jobs instead of one person doing it all from top to bottom. With this happening, workers are going to start trying to find their own labor or their own ability to have rights. So if they're working in a shoe factory, now they're wondering, well, why is their workday got to be so long? And why are they getting paid so little? And so they're going to start forming labor unions. Labor unions are going to be incredibly helpful for a lot of things. Our whole concept of an 8-hour workday and a Monday through Friday is from labor unions. They argued that that there should be a free public education for everybody, and that really a 10-hour workday was an appropriate day. And you can see that even today we don't really follow the 10-hour workday. We follow an 8-hour workday. But that's what really the labor unions were doing at first. They also will work and fight for things like pay, and they'll work and they'll fight for things like working conditions. And this is just a labor union is just a collective group of people who get together to fight for their rights as workers in a specific field. So you could have auto industry labor unions, you could have welding industry labor unions. Any of those are called unions. In 1834 and 36, an example of labor unions was the Lowell Girls. There was a guy who his last name was Lowell, and he had these factories called Lowell Girl factories, where he hired young girls who didn't have to stay at home. They could come work in the factory, live at the factory, and work all day long, and their money was used to help support the family. This was great for a lot of struggling families. However, sometimes the working conditions weren't very nice. Sometimes they had to work incredibly hard, long hours. And so these girls get together and they decide that they don't believe that this is right, that they have to do all these things. So they're going to create a union. And a union might come to their boss and say, we're not going back to work until these conditions are met. Ultimately, it's going to go to court. And the courts for a very long time in the United States are going to vote against the labor unions. They're going to vote and state that the labor unions should not be able to position themselves to hurt these businesses this way. So if you look here, I wanted to kind of bring a modern day example here. Look at the salaries of people in the United States and other countries, and look at the the amount of higher or specialized work that there is. So here at North America, blue is PhD, green is BA or bachelor's degree, and an MA is a master's degree. Look at how much more education can pay versus, look at these other countries. Look at Latin America. Look at the world in general. The two highest, right? Even if you go to Asia, compare Europe with North America. It's obvious that education and specialized skill are what allow people to get paid more money and be more successful. So let's talk a little bit about the class system that happened here. Really in the South, you're going to have a lot of different people who are going to be basically, you're going to have two groups. You're going to have the working class or the poor class, and you're going to have the upper class, the very, very rich. But if you look at the North, we start to see this group called the middle class forming. In the upper class, we have the factory owners themselves. They really can do whatever they want because they own the factory and they have a lot of money and they have a lot of time and a lot of energy. On the bottom, we have the class that we've always seen at the very bottom, which is the farmers, the factory workers, and the unskilled labor, the people actually working in the factory. These people are the poorest. They are working every day. They stayed in the cities usually next to the factory because they don't have an ability to drive or live far away. They live in these unsegregated areas, so they get close to a lot of different immigrants from different places. And they have what's called the family system, a system where the whole family is out working to try to support the rest of the family. But now we're starting to see, because of these factories and because of this work, a middle class. These are clerks who work for the factory, maybe book work and stuff like that, keeping track of the bills and everything like that. We have lawyers for those labor unions and for other groups. We have accountants who've got to keep track of the money, the brokers, same thing. We have retailers. These people are going to be a little bit wealthier than the working class, but not as rich as the upper class. And so they're going to move away from the cities. They're going to have more economic stability, and they're going to have much of a nicer life, a time where they can kind of go do things as family, have some time off. And this is the first time we're really starting to see a good middle class within the United States. So let's look at some immigration. There's a lot on this slide. Really what's important on this slide is red. On these other ones, yeah, you might take a lot more notes on this even if it's not red. But in this slide, just take anything that's red here. So in the 1840s, they brought a huge wave of immigrants. But these immigrants were primarily from Scotland and England. Okay? And if you look at it, it just continues to grow. In the 1830s, it doubled to 600,000. By 1840, it went up to 1.5 million. By 1850, it went up to 2.8 million. So you can see that immigration is just growing crazy, crazy fast. By the end of that, we're going to start to see more of some different immigrants coming. They're going to be primarily from Germany and Ireland. Now, there's going to be some issues with this. First off, why are these Germans and Irish men coming to America? Well, first and foremost, in Ireland, there was a fungus that destroyed all the potatoes in the country. I think a third of the population of Ireland died from the potato famine, and so these people have got to leave. They have no work, they have no food, they've got to go somewhere. It led to over 1 million people's deaths. Some are going to move to Australia, and others are going to move to the United States. Germany is going to be moving because there's a lot of political revolutions in Germany at the time. Lots of fighting. The government's not safe. There's lots of people killing each other. And so they're going to leave Germany and come to the United States. Most of these immigrants from Germany and Ireland are going to be Catholic or going to be a different type of Protestant. That's important when we talk about nationalism, okay? They migrated to the Northeast. Now, why didn't they go to the South? Because there was no jobs. They really couldn't do anything. There was either slave labor or there was being an owner of a farm, and they couldn't do either. So they moved to the Northeast because they could be a factory worker. 40% of the New Yorkers at this time were actually immigrants, okay? And they were competing for these jobs. But what this is going to do is there's going to be a rise in nationalism. People believe their traditions, their values, their country is the best way, and they're not going to like these new people moving in. You're going to see riots break out between Protestants and Catholics. The United States is a Protestant country, and so now you're going to see a bunch of Protestants getting angry at this new wave of Catholics who are coming in, okay? And this is going to be really happening a lot in Philadelphia and other large cities in the United States. In 1844, there was a massive riot. 10 years later in Baltimore, there was another massive riot. So we can see that this is another example of nationalism where people feel like their identity, their religion, their culture, their traditions are under attack and they don't like it. This group that we talk about that are really leading these riots are called nativists. Nativist is a vocab word for you. A nativist is a native-born person. They don't like newcomers. They believe that if you should be in the United States only if you're born in the United States, and that gives them more superior rights over others. So talking about the Southern agriculture and the economy in their society, we'll come back to this and we'll talk about this in class. This is just a question we have about should slavery had ended early on in America, and why didn't it? Why didn't George Washington, why didn't Thomas Jefferson end slavery at the very beginning? Why did it take until 1860, 1866 for slavery to finally end? We'll talk about that in class. So what's the South look like? Well, there's a lot of new developments. Don't think that the South is just agriculture and they don't have anything new going on. There have been some new inventions. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. This is going to transform the cotton industry forever. Cotton prices are going to increase from $5 million in 1793 to over $170 million in 1820. The only way they can do that is by producing more and more cotton. And this cotton is being primarily sold not just to the United States, but to countries like England and other countries like that. These new territories are conducive for cotton. We're adding new states like Florida, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and East Texas, which all have great climates for cotton. Cotton's going to be the #1 main export, and this makes sense. If you remember the Civil War, the North had the plan, the Anaconda Plan, the South had the King Cotton Plan, and that was their whole economy was based on this cotton. You can see why that slavery was such a big deal to them. Who are they going to have do all this work for cotton? Who's going to get 170 million, right, pounds of cotton in order to sell it in 1820? So cotton booms, slavery is also going to boom itself. Now, slave trading actually ended in 1808, so they're not getting slaves from Africa anymore. So the idea was that slavery would eventually end. But what ends up happening is that slaves are now treated like cattle. They're breeded to specifically get the best workers. Okay, so interstate trading and illegal trading. Non-cotton states started to trade slaves for money to cotton states. So they may not be making cotton, but they're directly benefiting from it by making it so they can sell and trade slaves. Slaves at the time period would have sold about $600 in 1802, and by 1860 it went up to $1,800. Now, to give you an idea of what that is, that's probably roughly around $40,000, give or take a couple $1,000s in today's money. So slaves were not cheap, and this is why very few people actually own slaves. The number of slaves in 1820 was 1.5 million, and by 1860 it went up to 4 million. So it's growing, but not by going to Africa and stealing slaves, but by breeding slaves. The economic consequences are huge. Plantations completely relied on cotton, and this is why they are so adamant about not getting rid of slaves. They don't have these these urban city centers. They don't have the population. They have slaves and they have their own family. That's it. So northern populations are going to keep growing as new immigrants come into it, while southern immigrants are going to, or not southern immigrants, but southerners are going to remain the same. Now, this is going to have very long-lasting impacts. Even today, we can look at these two areas and we can see huge impacts from this. So let's look at education in the South and the North. 15% of people in the South were illiterate. That's 3 times the amount that the North or even the West had. Today, the United States, I think illiteracy is like less than 2%. So almost everybody in the United States can read to some degree. A quarter of the men actually had slaves in the South. So 25% of men actually had slaves. I was wrong on my statistic I gave earlier. Only 3/4 of that quarter had fewer than 10 slaves. So why was this such a big deal then? If so few people actually owned slaves and had a large majority of slaves, then why did the rest of the white people in the South care? Well, you got to remember that to the slave, owning a slave was like owning a brand new pickup or owning a BMW. It was a status symbol to people. It was the idea that one day, even though I'm poor right now, maybe I will be able to get slaves and make a status for myself. That is completely really not true. Most of the time, white Southerners never became rich. They actually, a lot of them died poorer than what they had started with. But it's going to be this idea that they hope that one day they themselves will have the ability to be rich and have slaves. The other thing they're worried about is if you let these slaves go, what are they going to do? They might get guns, they might have revenge, they might start up a rebellion. This is scary for a lot of people because they have for years been enslaving people and treating them terribly. So white superiority is going to be a major belief too at the time. In the North and South, it's not just a Southern thing. It's most of the country is racist. They believe 100% that white people are superior over minorities. And slavery is going to become this great institution, they believe, and they're going to defend it, not just as a thing to help with our economy, but as a way to help lower people. They aren't smart enough to take care of themselves, so we have to do it for them, right? If you look at this graph, this is kind of an interesting one. Here the pink is a U.S. citizen that's a native. This blue is a U.S. citizen that is naturalized, and this orange is non-U.S. citizens. I think this is really significant because you can see where, as higher education goes, who's getting the most education and who's not. You can see that U.S. citizens who are naturalized are getting a lot of the higher education because most of the time when they've come over here, there's a specific reason why. So to finish this off, I just wanted to share this story with you guys here. This picture down here in the bottom right is an old slave plantation in South Carolina in a city called Varnville. This is a distant relative of mine named Jerry VARN and his wife. Jerry was incredibly tall, like over 7 feet tall, and here's the old plantation house. I've been here. This is a really kind of cool old now hunting lodge. They have 7,000 acres of hunting now that they have. But I think it's really interesting the ideas and the cultural attitudes of the people at this time period. I've never met Jerry himself. I've met his son, who now Jerry Sr. is dead. His son Jerry Jr. is now in charge. And I think it's really interesting what he has to say about his plantation. Here's a newspaper article written about Jerry about slavery. It says, I asked about the slaves, this is the reporter talking, that once lived on the family plantation. And here too his ideas reflect another time. He's talking about Jerry. The plantation had slaves, he acknowledges, but by the time the Civil War came, slavery was becoming unprofitable. So he says slavery was not as big of a deal coming into the Civil War. A lot of people say that when somebody's a slave, they don't have any rights, but they don't really understand. Sometimes slaves would be bought for $1,000 a piece. And when you put that into perspective, a dollar then was worth 2.5 cents today. So today that slave would be worth $40,000. And isn't it just logical that you're not going to abuse something you paid $40,000 for? You don't pay that much for an automobile, and you certainly don't abuse that. The other thing is that they gave these people free health care. The doctor came and checked them out every 30 days. Now, a slave in Russia today, you know, in one of those gulags or something, that is one thing. 5 or 6 people in a tiny cell, no heat, sleeping on the floor. But these blacks were very much loved by their masters, like the extended family of the plantation. So what this is important is this is something a historian would see and they would want to read and try to understand from today's perspectives on those people in the past. And this really demonstrates kind of the attitude that Southerners had over African Americans and what they believed they were doing. Doesn't this demonstrate kind of this idea that we are taking care of these people? We're justifying slavery because we're actually taking care of them. So he continues, says, let me tell you, the talk about slavery is a mean and vicious. That comes from people that don't know that what they really are talking about. Just like during the time of the Civil Rights Movement, there's a lot of people trying to tell us what to do down here. We're getting along just fine down here, but those investigators wanted to come down and start things up. In the earlier day, those northern liberals were the abolitionists, same kind of people. So Jerry resents these Northerners. He resents these people because of a lot of reasons. Number one, the Northerners are coming down to the South trying to change the tradition, the culture, the attitudes, and the viewpoints of the Southerners. He sees them as stirring up trouble, when most people today look at this as people fighting for equality. What's important for us to look at today is, what about our own time period? Are we threatened and upset about our cultures changing today because we're holding on to deep-rooted, prejudiced ideas, or are we really fighting for something that's important? So, objective one, what differences separated the North from the South? There are lots, and you should hopefully have written a lot of them. It could be schooling, it could be different jobs, it could be manufacturing, it could be capital, it could be population, it could be any of those things. Lots and lots of things that separate the North and the South. Next question, shouldn't we celebrate diversity? Hopefully you're able to kind of think about that for a second and to kind of frame your own opinion. Objective 3, is it possible, and if so, how do people live in diversity? If we're really going to say that diversity is a good thing, how do we try to solve this problem where when new people move in with their new cultures, ideas, and attitudes, how do we make it so that the former people, the people already living here, are able to accept and also maintain their own identity? And objective 4, what correlations do we see with sectional differences today? So think about today, all the differences. Where are those differences lying in the country, and how do we see them? Hopefully that helps, guys. Have a good one.